25 men in a single night. That number would echo through the marble halls of Rome like a curse, whispered behind closed doors, written in forbidden scrolls, erased and rewritten again. It was not the boast of a courtesan or the legend of a tavern girl. It was a confession carved into the rotting heart of an empire. The woman at the center of it all was not a slave, not a performer, but an empress, Valeria Messalina, wife of Emperor Claudius, mother of Rome's heir, and the most powerful woman alive. But that night, power was not enough. In the suffocating luxury of her palace, wrapped in silk and silence, Messalina found herself drowning in the one thing no crown could protect her from: boredom. The world lay beneath her feet, yet she felt hollow, unseen, unalive. So she made a choice that defied reason, dignity, and empire itself. She would strip herself of the purple, descend into the filth of Rome's underworld, and challenge its most infamous prostitute to a contest of endurance. A game that would shake the empire, destroy her dynasty, and expose the disease festering in the heart of power, in the glittering heart of imperial Rome. Within chambers perfumed by roses imported from Egypt and guarded by statues of forgotten gods, the young empress Valeria Messalina reclined upon sheets dyed in royal purple, staring at the ceiling as if its gilded constellations might speak back to her. She was 23 years old and already the most envied woman on earth, yet she felt imprisoned in a palace of perfection. Her husband, Emperor Claudius, ruled the world with decrees written in trembling ink, but she ruled the shadows with glances and whispers. Every luxury known to humankind lay within reach: banquets, villas, silks, slaves, dancers, philosophers. But each pleasure only deepened the void that gnawed at her soul. The marble floors beneath her bare feet were colder than any dungeon, for they reflected not chains of iron, but chains of expectation. She was the divine Augusta, mother of the air, the embodiment of virtue and fertility. But behind the ceremonial smiles and the rehearsed gestures, Messalina felt herself dissolve into nothingness. Her husband adored her, though not as a man adores a woman. Claudius, 58 years old and shaped by decades of ridicule, loved her as a collector loves a perfect statue, something to be polished, displayed, and never truly touched. His affection was safe, sterile, devoid of danger. To the Senate he was a scholar, to the legions a reluctant god, but to Messalina he was the silence that smothered her. When he spoke of grain shipments, aqueduct repairs, or the endless bureaucracy of empire, she nodded, smiling faintly, while her mind wandered to the subterranean hum of the city below, the laughter, the sin, the warmth of real life pulsing through Rome's veins. She envied the chaos of the streets, the freedom of the nameless, to be seen not as an empress, but as flesh. In those nights of feverish isolation, her mirror became her only confidant. Its silvered surface reflected not a woman but an idol, a flawless illusion sculpted by power. Every time she looked, she saw less of herself. Her beauty, once a weapon, had turned into a curse, a perfection so blinding that no one dared look beyond it. Lovers came and went, each more desperate than the last, but they sought the legend of Messalina, not the heart of Valeria. Senators, poets, gladiators all surrendered themselves at her feet, yet none could touch the loneliness that lurked behind her eyes. She began to realize that power, in its purest form, was not freedom but suffocation. The more she controlled, the less she felt. The more she was worshipped, the less she existed. And so a thought began to take root within her, a poisonous, intoxicating thought that whispered through her sleepless nights. What if, just once, she could abandon the marble mask and become someone else entirely? What if she could walk among the forgotten, stripped of title and expectation, and taste the raw air of the living? That idea was madness, of course. An empress could no more vanish into the gutter than the sun could hide behind the moon. But madness was precisely what seduced her. For Messalina, the line between reason and rebellion had already blurred beyond recognition. The court's intrigues bored her, the Senate's flattery sickened her, and even cruelty had lost its thrill. She had destroyed reputations, exiled philosophers, and manipulated ministers. But each victory felt hollow, each act of domination only deepened her yearning to be defeated. In that yearning lay the seed of her downfall. She began to imagine not conquest but surrender, not command but exposure. To feel something real, she would have to lose control completely. She needed danger, not safety, shame, not glory, flesh, not divinity. The empire worshipped her as untouchable, but she longed to be touched, to be stripped of power, until only the pulse of existence remained. Somewhere in the labyrinth of her mind, the figure of Loba was born, a name stolen from the gutter, a mask fashioned from desperation. Loba, the wolf-woman, the mirror opposite of the Augusta. Each day, as Claudius buried himself in scrolls and maps, Messalina rehearsed her descent. She studied the gestures of slaves, the dialect of taverns, the scent of cheap oil and sweat. She sent her handmaids to fetch rough wool garments, to soil them with dust and ash until they carried the stench of survival. Her transformation was not impulsive, it was ritual, almost religious. She was not fleeing the palace, she was exorcising it. In her mind, the marble halls of the Palatine had become a mausoleum where passion had died centuries ago. To escape, she would have to resurrect her humanity in the filth of the Subura, the red-lit maze where Rome's forgotten bodies traded warmth for coins and oblivion for wine. By the time the moon rose over the Tiber, her decision was complete. The Empress of Rome would become its ghost. In secret, she prepared her disguise, a rough wig of straw-colored hair, a tunic of coarse fabric that scraped against her skin, a new name that no one would question. As she stared at herself in the mirror one final time, she did not see Messalina, the divine consort of the emperor. She saw a stranger staring back, eyes blazing with forbidden hunger. Power had devoured her soul, and only degradation could set it free. The night she chose to fall from grace was not born of impulse, but of meticulous, perverse intention. Messalina understood that in Rome, every act of rebellion was also a performance, and she meant for her descent to be her greatest stage. When the lamps of the Palatine Hill were dimmed and the corridors silenced by the hush of loyal servants, she emerged from her chambers not as an empress but as a phantom shedding its skin. Her maids, bound by fear and fascination, dressed her in rags that once belonged to slaves, coarse fabric that burned against her skin like a confession. They powdered her face with ash to dull the radiance that betrayed her, and replaced the scent of nard and myrrh with the acrid oil that clung to the taverns of the poor. The transformation was blasphemous, but it thrilled her. Each humiliation, each detail that stripped away the sanctity of her station, brought her closer to feeling alive. In the mirror, she saw not the divine Augusta, but the creature she had invented. Loba, the wolf among rats, the shadow in the filth. The Subura awaited her, like an open wound festering at the heart of Rome. It was the city's underbelly, a maze of alleyways slick with wine and sweat, where laughter and death shared the same breath. The air was thick with the stench of spilled oil, rancid meat, and cheap incense burned to disguise the smell of despair. Here, emperors were rumors, and gods were jokes. The streets belonged to those who had nothing left to lose: thieves, soldiers, ex-slaves, and the forgotten women whose faces bore the exhaustion of centuries. As Messalina stepped from her litter, her sandals touched earth that had never known the weight of imperial feet. The sounds of drunken songs and muffled arguments swallowed her presence, and for the first time in her life she was invisible. The thrill was electric. She could walk without being bowed to, look without being judged, breathe without being watched. In anonymity, she found a freedom that her crown had always denied her. But freedom in Rome's gutters was paid for with fear. Every glance carried danger, every shadow hinted at violence. Yet Messalina welcomed it. She moved through the taverns and brothels like a moth drawn to the fire, intoxicated by the vulgar vitality that pulsed through the district. Her disguise was perfect. No one saw the empress, only a bold, reckless woman with the hunger of a predator behind her eyes. When she entered the Lupanar of Scylla, the most notorious brothel in the Subura, she crossed the invisible border between sin and legend. The walls inside were painted with obscene frescoes, faded by smoke and sweat. The air vibrated with moans, laughter, and the metallic rhythm of coins striking the counter. Beneath the glow of oil lamps, Scylla herself appeared, a woman scarred by pleasure and profit, the reigning queen of this infernal court. Her eyes, sharp and amused, scanned the stranger before her and found something unsettling in that poise, that defiance. The encounter between Scylla and Loba was not chance. It was design. Messalina had come not for desire, but for confrontation. When she proposed the contest, the room fell silent. 25 men, one night, no surrender. A competition of endurance, not for gold or glory, but for annihilation. Scylla laughed, thinking the pale stranger insane, but she saw in her gaze something that mirrored her own, the hunger to be broken. The terms were accepted, and word spread through the brothel like wildfire. Patrons placed bets, slaves whispered omens, and the torches along the corridor burned brighter as if sensing the blasphemy to come. Outside, Rome slept in its illusion of order, while its empress was reborn in degradation. The distance between the Palatine and the Subura was less than 2 miles, but it might as well have been 2 worlds, one of marble and law, the other of flesh and chaos. Yet both were bound by the same law of appetite. As the night deepened, Loba once Messalina felt the last traces of her former self dissolve. The silk of the palace had been replaced by the rough embrace of sin. The divine quiet of power had given way to the raw, obscene chorus of survival. She was no longer worshipped, and for the first time in her existence, she felt infinite. Her descent was complete, and with it, the empire's fate had already begun to crack. For when divinity chooses to crawl among the damned, the gods themselves begin to die. The night that followed would be remembered by none, and yet echo through eternity. Whispered only in secret among Rome's darkest chronicles. Within the suffocating walls of the lupanar, the torches flickered with a trembling flame, casting monstrous silhouettes upon the frescoes that adorned the chamber. The air was thick-heavy with wine, incense, and the animal breath of men who came to witness what no mortal eyes should have seen. At the center of that fevered gloom stood 2 women who could not have been more opposite, yet were now equals before the same abyss. On one side, Scylla, the reigning queen of flesh, her body hardened by years of surviving the city's cruelty, her reputation built upon endurance that bordered on myth. On the other, the stranger called Loba, whose poise carried an unspoken danger. None in the room knew that behind that veil of dust and sweat hid the Empress of Rome, the woman whose nod could condemn them all to death before dawn. But tonight, her power was buried beneath grime and desire, her divinity stripped away like an old robe. When the first man stepped forward, the room exhaled as one. The contest began not with violence, but with ritual, the rhythm of flesh against time, of arrogance unraveling into exhaustion. The audience cheered, cursed, drank, and bet in a frenzy that blurred into madness. Loba's eyes did not waver. She was not there to win, she was there to feel, to drown herself in the experience of being reduced to nothing more than a body, a vessel of hunger and endurance. For every act, for every humiliation, she peeled away another layer of her former self. The empress who once signed decrees and decided the fate of senators now lay captive to sensations that mocked her former grandeur. There was no throne here, no courtiers, no gods. Only the primal chorus of panting men, the acrid sting of oil lamps, and the relentless gaze of Scylla, whose expression shifted slowly from amusement to fear. Hour after hour, the contest dragged on. The torches burned low, the wine turned to vinegar in the cups. The spectators who had gathered for entertainment began to realize they were witnessing something far darker, something sacred in its desecration. Loba's body trembled but did not falter. Her mind slipped into a trance beyond exhaustion, where pain and ecstasy became indistinguishable. Every breath was a rebellion against her former self, every motion an act of defiance against the sterile perfection of the palace. When Scylla finally collapsed, her strength spent, her pride shattered, Loba remained. The Empress had conquered not her opponent, but her own divinity. The Count had reached 25, and still she endured, driven by something that transcended lust or vanity. She was proving to herself that she could bleed, that she could break, that she could feel what it meant to be alive among the condemned. When the final man withdrew and the brothel fell silent, the world seemed to stop breathing. The spectators, too stunned to speak, looked upon her not with lust but with awe and terror. Scylla lay motionless beside her, defeated, her legend extinguished in a single night. Loba, drenched in sweat and shadow, rose unsteadily to her feet. Her chest heaved, her eyes gleamed not with victory, but with revelation. She had touched the core of her humanity and found it poisoned. The silence that followed was not peace, it was judgment. Even the walls seemed to recoil, as if the painted gods feared the blasphemy they had just witnessed. Some said that dawn crept through the windows like a ghost that dared not enter. The pale light revealed what the darkness had concealed, the face of a woman both divine and damned. The servants of the lupanar, too afraid to speak her name, watched as she wrapped herself in a discarded cloak and vanished into the alleys of the Subura. Behind her, the chamber reeked of sweat, smoke, and something unholy, an offering to the void. She had triumphed, yes, but triumph was meaningless now. The hunger that had driven her descent had not been sated, it had merely evolved. She had proved herself mortal only to find that mortality was more terrifying than the marble prison she had fled. As she made her way back toward the Palatine Hill, the dawn broke like a wound across the horizon. Rome awoke, unaware that its empress had walked through its filth, conquered its queen of sin, and returned crowned with a shame too profound for words. In her mind, she believed she had escaped consequence, that her secret would remain buried among the nameless. But the gods of Rome are not merciful. The night she believed had freed her had, in truth, already begun her undoing. For in the empire of power, nothing hidden remains buried for long. The contest of 25 men was no longer a game, it was the opening act of divine retribution. When Messalina returned to the marble silence of the Palatine, the dawn's first light glimmered upon the city's roofs like the dying embers of a forbidden fire. She walked through the palace corridors with her cloak clinging to her skin, the scent of the Subura still clinging to her like a curse. The maids who saw her dared not speak, for her eyes, hollow and feverish, carried a new and dangerous light. She bathed herself in milk and rose water, scrubbing her body as though she could wash away what she had done, yet the act of cleansing only deepened her corruption. Beneath the surface calm of her ritual lay a revelation too dark to contain. She had found the boundary between power and ruin, and it had thrilled her. Claudius, the emperor she called husband, was far away, lost in the arithmetic of empire, tallying taxes, cataloguing men and cattle as if the world could be tamed by numbers. He did not see that the most perilous rebellion of all was unfolding not on the frontiers of Britannia, but within the walls of his own bedchamber. For a time, Messalina's secret survived, sealed behind the masks of ceremony and the complicity of servants who loved their lives too much to whisper the truth. But desire, once awakened, is a beast that does not sleep again. The thrill of degradation had only sharpened her hunger for danger. She began to invite new lovers into her orbit, senators, gladiators, poets, any man who could feed the fire she had lit within herself. The palace became her private theater of corruption, where she staged elaborate spectacles of seduction, not for pleasure, but for proof that her will remained supreme. The wives of the nobility were summoned, humiliated, and broken for sport. What had begun as a secret rebellion against power had become an addiction to its inversion. To Messalina, each scandal was a masterpiece, each outrage, a reminder that she could twist Rome's morality into her plaything and still be worshipped as divine. Yet every empire is sustained not by its ruler's virtue, but by the silence of those who profit from it. Claudius's freedmen, Narcissus, Pallas, and Callistus, had built their fortunes on their proximity to her, closing their eyes to her crimes so long as her hand fed them. They were Rome's invisible government, the keepers of its lies. But power, once shared, breeds envy, and envy, once seated, blooms in betrayal. Among them, Narcissus, the sharpest and coldest of the three, began to sense that the empress's recklessness was no longer profitable. It was fatal. He saw that her appetites had grown into a monster too vast to contain, one that threatened not only her own life, but the fragile structure of Rome's stability. And so he began to watch her, as one studies a doomed star, brilliant, beautiful, and collapsing under its own gravity. Messalina's next obsession would seal her fate. His name was Gaius Silius, a man of aristocratic blood and unbearable beauty, chosen to be consul in the coming year. To her, he was everything Claudius was not, youthful, bold, alive. At first, their affair was discreet, veiled in the same secrecy that had preserved her other transgressions. But secrecy was not in her nature. The thrill lay in exposure, in daring the gods themselves to strike her down. Soon she flaunted Silius openly, parading him through the palace as though the emperor's blindness rendered her immune. She forced Silius to divorce his wife and installed him in the imperial chambers. The whispers began, but she no longer cared. The Senate trembled, the generals muttered, and still Claudius remained unaware, cocooned in his scholar's delusion that the empire obeyed his reason. It was then that Messalina made the one decision even her admirers could not comprehend. Bored with adultery, weary of secrecy, she decided to make her union with Silius official, not in the shadows, but in broad daylight. She ordered a wedding to be held, complete with priests, witnesses, and vows. The Empress of Rome would marry another man while her husband still sat upon the throne of the world. It was not simply madness, it was suicide written in silk. To her, it was a game of power pushed to its ultimate limit, a test to see whether the empire that bowed before her would dare to raise its hand against her. To everyone else, it was treason. Narcissus, who had watched her fall with morbid fascination, understood that this was the moment to strike. His survival depended on her destruction. While she prepared garlands for her new marriage, he prepared soldiers for her death. In the villa on the Pincian Hill, the wedding feast roared with laughter, wine, and oblivion. Messalina, draped in a saffron veil, toasted her new husband as Rome's elite looked on in frozen terror. They understood that to celebrate with her was complicity, but to refuse was death. In that grotesque theater of power and delusion, the fate of an empire was sealed. For while the empress danced, Narcissus rode through the night to the emperor's camp, carrying not rumors but witnesses, the concubines of Claudius himself, who whispered the truth into the old man's ear until the weight of it shattered his denial. In that instant, the scholar became the executioner. The machinery of vengeance began to turn. The empress who had once commanded legions would soon find herself hunted by the same blade she had once kissed. When the veil of madness finally tore, the empire moved with the precision of a machine that had been waiting for its command. As the news of Messalina's mock wedding spread, Narcissus seized his chance with the cold efficiency of a bureaucrat turned executioner. He reached Claudius at the port of Ostia, where the emperor was dutifully inspecting the grain fleets that kept Rome alive. The smell of salt, fish, and wet hemp filled the air as Narcissus approached with a face carved from stone and words that would unmake a dynasty. At first, Claudius refused to believe him. His mind, fragile and scholarly, could not reconcile the absurdity of the accusation with the woman he worshipped. It was only when his own concubines, those who had seen and whispered the truth, confirmed the betrayal that the emperor's reason fractured. The report of the wedding contract, sealed and witnessed, fell upon him like divine thunder. The world that had seemed orderly and measured collapsed into chaos. The man who had once catalogued his empire by names and numbers suddenly understood that his own home had become a province of treason. Narcissus did not wait for imperial clarity. He took command of the Praetorian Guard and ordered the return to Rome at once. Within hours, the city that had feasted on gossip awoke to terror. Messalina's villa on the Pincian Hill, still echoing with music and laughter from the night before, was surrounded by soldiers whose faces were hidden behind iron masks. The torches they carried reflected in the marble like the flames of an impending judgment. Inside, the empress who had defied gods and emperors alike felt the first tremor of fear she had known since her youth. Her guests scattered, their loyalty dissolving in the panic of self-preservation. Silius, her lover and newlywed, tried to reason, to command, to plead, but his words fell into the void. By the time the soldiers broke through the gates, the man once hailed as Rome's most beautiful had been dragged into the courtyard and executed without trial. His blood darkened the stones, mingling with the spilled wine of their celebration, and his lifeless body was left as a warning to anyone who had mistaken lust for power. Messalina fled into the gardens, barefoot and trembling, her saffron wedding veil torn and stained. She who had ruled the world now stumbled through the shadows like an animal hunted through its own cage. She sought refuge in the house of her mother, Domitia Lepida, whose face bore neither anger nor compassion, only the cold resignation of a patrician who had seen too many gods fall from marble pedestals. There, among the laurel trees and the withered fountains, the Empress of Rome waited for the inevitable. Narcissus, unwilling to risk the emperor's pity, dispatched centurions with a single, merciless order: "End it before Claudius can change his mind." They found her kneeling by a small altar, clutching a dagger too light to match her shaking hands. Lepida, whose love was indistinguishable from contempt, urged her to die with dignity, to take her fate as a Roman. But Messalina's courage, so great in sin, deserted her in repentance. The hand that had signed executions could not guide the blade upon itself. When the soldiers entered, she turned toward them, not as a goddess or a queen, but as a child, stripped of illusions. They did not wait for her plea. Steel flashed, and the life of Valeria Messalina, once empress, once loba, ended upon the cold earth of her own garden. The report reached Claudius as he sat surrounded by trembling senators and scribes. When Narcissus leaned in to whisper that the deed was done, the emperor merely nodded and returned to his meal. Those who were present swore he showed neither sorrow nor relief, as though some invisible hand had erased the memory of his wife before the blood on her body had dried. The empire moved on, eager to seal the scandal beneath layers of decree and ritual. The Senate, in its frenzy to prove loyalty, issued the damnatio memoriae, the condemnation of memory. Her statues were toppled, her inscriptions erased, her coins melted down. The woman who had risked everything to be seen, to feel, to exist beyond the hollow perfection of power, was condemned to eternal invisibility. Rome devoured her name as it devoured all those who had once believed themselves untouchable. Yet the paradox of Messalina's fall was that her death did not end her story, it merely shifted its form. In purging her, Rome had cleared the path for another empress far more dangerous. Within months, Claudius remarried, persuaded by his advisors and manipulated by his freedmen into taking Agrippina the Younger, his own niece, as wife. Where Messalina had burned with passion, Agrippina ruled with ice. Where one had sought freedom through sin, the other pursued domination through intellect and cruelty. She did not crave sensation, she craved empire. Her son, Lucius Domitius, would become Nero, the boy whose name would turn Rome's twilight into an inferno. In killing Messalina, Narcissus believed he had saved the empire. In truth, he had delivered it into the hands of its future destroyer. The flames that consumed the Palatine a decade later would be the echo of that night's silent dagger, the judgment deferred but never denied. So ends the tale of the empress who sought to prove that even gods can bleed. Her legacy lies not in her infamy, but in the reflection she forced upon power itself. The revelation that the divine mask of empire hides only human hunger. Messalina's downfall was not the corruption of Rome, it was its mirror. Beneath the marble, beneath the grandeur, every empire conceals its own brothel, every ruler their secret contest, every century its Messalina. And if her story still draws breath in the whispers of history, it is because the same fire that burned her continues to smolder in us, the dangerous desire to feel alive, even if it means destroying everything we are. If you found yourself lost within this forgotten empire of desire and ruin, then do not let it fade into silence. Like, subscribe, and stand witness as we unearth more secrets Rome tried to bury forever.